Thank you very much, Devashish, and good morning. And I can't tell you how much of a privilege it is for me to be here today, all the way from Bangladesh, and to be part of this event. So I'd like to thank the sponsors. I'd like to thank Devashish, Aneshade, and everyone else who's been part of this wonderful program. I'm going to read a paper slightly differently titled from the one that Devashish announced. This is called the Gitanjali in Translation, A Miracle of Transformation. And I'm also going to ask your indulgence. I'd like to read from a few of my translations of Gitanjali, which I've been doing, which I'm working on at the moment, and one or two other poems, if you will allow me. So maybe a bit too miscellaneous, but we'll see. The Gitanjali in Translation, A Miracle of Transformation. The sesquicentenary of Rabindranath's birth is less than a year away. The centenary of the publication of the English Gitanjali will be with us in 1912. And his Nobel Prize Award centenary is only 3 years away. This forum then is an appropriate occasion to look at the English Gitanjali and reflect on its astonishing impact. I intend to examine the genesis of the volume, its publication history, its initial reception, and comment on its rise and fall in critical esteem. More specifically, I would like to ask what accounted for its spectacular success on its publication. How did this seemingly too wispy collection and oh so delicate prose translations of almost ineffable and quite mystical verse, stemming from the obscure Bengali Vaishnava tradition, make Rabindranath into the universal poet almost overnight? Why did it succeed so dramatically, while almost all of Tagore's subsequent collections failed? The first point that I'd like to make about the writing, publication, and initial reception of the English Gitanjali is that the whole process was nothing less than miraculous. No less a poet critic than Buddhadev Boshu has said so. For in his excellent book on modern Bengali poetry, An Acre of Green Grass, he declares that the English version of the book is nothing less than, quote, a miracle of translation, unquote, because of the way Rabindranath managed to transfer the Bengali poems into English, making the delicate, quote, flowers bloom anew on foreign soil, unquote. Was Rabindranath too prophetically thinking of his work as a miracle, even as he translated the poems, when he wrote in the one numbered number 63, "Thou hast made me known to friends whom I knew not. Thou hast given me seats in homes not my own. Thou hast brought the distant near and made a brother of the stranger." Then again, cannot one use number 12 to explain why the English Gitanjali, at times so differently composed from the original Bengali poems, has succeeded so noticeably? It is the most distant course that comes nearest to thyself, and the training is the most intricate that leads us to the utter simplicity of a tune. To begin then with the story of the English Gitanjali's publication. Rabindranath was about 50 years old in 1911, when his urge to travel made him think of going to England for the third time. But soon after he decided to make the trip, he fell ill and had to reschedule his departure. In convalescence, spent mostly at Shilaidaho on the banks of the river Podwan, he decided he would spend his time by translating some of the poems he had written in recent volumes such as Gitanjali, Nayada, Khya, and Gitamala, as part of his preparation for his trip. Perhaps encouraged by the knowledge that there was some interest in his poetry in the country he was heading for, because of a few translations done by his admirers, which had been well received in England. In any case, he wrote the following in a letter to his niece, Indira Devi. "On the day I was to board the ship, I fainted due to my frantic efforts on leave-taking, and the journey itself was postponed. Then I went to Shilaidaho to take rest. But unless the brain is active, one does not feel strong enough to relax completely, so that the only way to keep myself calm was to take up some light work." He goes on in the letter to say that the spring air seemed to have stirred the musician in him, but that he did not have the energy to, quote, write anything new, and so he set himself to translate them one by one. the Gitanjali poems, I mean. As was his wont in writing letters to her in this period of life, he seems to be really thinking out loud about the impulses behind the act of translation that he had undertaken at a very creative and yet languid phase of his life. I simply felt an urge to recapture through the medium of another language the feelings and sentiments which had created such a feast of joy within me in the days gone by. Unquote. Apparently, this creative impulse continued when he had recovered sufficiently to undertake the journey to England. On the deck of the ship, he informs his niece in the rest of the letter. He went on with his translations. Soon he had finished the exercise book with which he had begun his work and took up another one. By the time he landed in England, his manuscript included more than 100 of the delicate and often mystical poems he had translated over a period of months. As an aside, in this examination of this marvel of translation, let us remember that the briefcase containing the manuscript was lost by his son Rabindranath in a London underground compartment. But fortunately, and should we not say miraculously, it was retrieved the next day from the underground lost properties office. In London, he eventually made contact with their family friend and fellow artist William Rothenstein, and immediately told him about his recent work in English. The painter wanted to see the poems. Rothenstein was immediately stirred by them. He recorded his response thus: "I read the poems. Here was poetry of a new order, which seemed to be on a level with that of the great mystics." He showed the poems to the famous Shakespearean scholar A.C. Bradley, who confirmed that his response was right by saying, "It looks as though we have at last a great poet among us again." Rothenstein wasted no time in trying to promote the poems amongst his circle of friends and artists in London. He had met Rabindranath when he had been to the Jorashaka house of the Tagores in his 1910 tour of India, and had found him a striking figure for a portrait, although he had apparently not discovered the extent of his poetic genius then. But he now told Rabindranath that he was excited by the poems he had read, and took his permission to pass the translations on to Yeats. Yeats's response to the English Gitanjali is well recorded in his introduction to the English Gitanjali. As he said so famously in it, "I've carried the manuscript of these translations with me for days, reading it on railway trains or on the top of omnibuses and in restaurants. I often had to close it lest some strangers see how much it moved me." Yeats and his friends and fellow artists were even more impressed by Tagore Evening, held at Rothenstein's initiative on July 7, 1912. As Harold Hurwitz has so succinctly put it in a paper on Yeats and Rabindranath, shortly after the event, and partly because of it, Tagore was catapulted into the center of the London literary scene. Yeats decided that he would help Tagore improve the translations with an eye towards publishing the poems, and joined Rothenstein in promoting Rabindranath to the English public. In introducing the Indian poet to the London literati, he declared, "To take part in honoring Mr. Rabindranath Tagore is one of the great events in my artistic life. I know of no man in my times who has done anything in the English language to equal his lyrics." Hurwitz notes that Yeats's recorded comments suggest that, if anything, his admiration for the poems increased in subsequent months. After all, hadn't he himself predicted in the introduction that the poems would be hummed by travelers, men rowing in boats, and lovers going forever? The verse of Gitanjali had declared unequivocally, articulated a whole people. Yeats even detected an element of the uncanny in his feelings for the verse. As he put it so memorably, "We have met our own image, our voice as in a dream." Ezra Pound, then in London, was also swept away by the power of the English Gitanjali poems that he heard being recited that Tagore evening. Horace notes in another paper on Rabindranath and Pound that the American poet's excitement in being privileged to receive the work of Mr. Tagore before the public had heard it is clear in the comparison he made in an essay soon after, where he compared his feelings to that of Boccaccio on first being exposed to Dante's verse. The master craftsman, identified by no less a source than T.S. Eliot as the only begetter of the wasteland, gushed about Rabindranath's poems in a letter to Harriet Monroe thus: "They are translated by the author into very beautiful English prose, with mastery of cadence. In an essay published in the December 1912 issue of Poetry, Pound observed that the verse was written in meters, perhaps the most finished and most subtle of any known to us. In the essay, he also suggested a thematic reason for the fascinating quality of the English Gitanjali. The work brings to us the pledge of a calm which we need ever much in the age of steel and mechanics. It brings a quiet proclamation of the fellowship between man and nature. Rothenstein, Yeats, Pound, and later Stopford Brooks, Moore, and many other writers have recorded their appreciation for the English Gitanjali and waxed enthusiastically about the beauty of the translated poems in the writings and letters. Their interest led to the volume being published in England, first by the India Society in November 1912, and then by Macmillan the year after. As a result, the fascination of Rabindranath's English verse seemingly increased exponentially month by month. The TLS review of the India Society edition seemed to be especially acute in accounting for the distinctive nature of the song offerings. The poems had attained harmony of emotion and idea. They were not unlike the Psalms of David in the prophetic mystical quality. And the verse was always simple but never simplistic. Or as the anonymous reviewer phrased his praise of the poet, as a poet should be, he's so simple that anyone can understand him. Yet this does not mean that there is little to understand. In his introduction to the French translation of Gitanjali, Gide voiced a similar sentiment when he said that he admired the volume for its slenderness, for being uncluttered with mythologies, and therefore needing no preparatory work for the reader. The Nobel Prize soon confirmed internationally what many of the leading lights of European literature of the age had believed. The translation was a triumph of the translator's art, magical, cadenced, beautiful, serene, simple but not simplistic, as well as evidence of the poet's intense spirituality. The quality of the work, and therefore the translations, continue to be admired implicitly or explicitly by the ever-increasing admirers of the English Gitanjali for the next few years. So the English translations were being translated into the major European languages. The story of the way the collection gathered critical momentum all over Europe and attracted the Nobel Prize within a year after the publication of the Indian Society volume is too well known to be repeated here. But the reactions recorded above will confirm that the translations were consistently considered excellent, even if the soothing and inspirational nature of the contents were believed to be the main reasons for the success of the volume in war-bedevilled, angst-ridden Europe. Unfortunately, Rabindranath's achievement as a translator of his own work was soon forgotten by the very writers who had been so stirred by the poems. Later generations of Westerners have certainly not found as much to appreciate even in the English Gitanjali. Yeats himself would soon criticize Tagore the translator in a letter to Rothenstein in 1935, where he suggests that his initial translations had succeeded only because he and Serge Moore had vetted them. Although we do well to remember here that Rothenstein had said clearly elsewhere that the extent of Yeats's revisions was limited and should not be overemphasized. But for sure, Yeats was scathing about Tagore's English 2 decades later, when he declared that the English poet knows no English, no Indian knows English. Nobody can write with music and style in a language not learned in childhood, and since then, the language of his thought. It is as if in condemning Tagore's later English translations, which he and almost everyone felt was rushed and carelessly put together, he is also criticizing the first volume of translation that he had himself praised to the skies. For his part, Pound too would change his tunes even more quickly and without waiting to react to the undoubtedly inferior later translations. Thus, a year after the Tagore evening, we find him saying,